It's U of L Today on 93.9 The Ville. Here's your host, Mark Hebert.
And welcome to U of L Today with Mark Hebert on 93.9 The Ville. So glad you're joining us for the show that's about all things University of Louisville. Well, probably with the exception of athletics. We don't talk about sports too much on this program, but we talk about everything else that's going on at U of L. The research, the great students, faculty, programming, and just everything that's happening at the University of Louisville. You can find out about it here on this show, U of L Today with Mark Hebert. All right, so coming up a little bit later in the show, U of L is opening an eating disorder clinic and laboratory to do research on an issue that strikes millions of Americans, including a lot of teenagers. And we'll talk with two of the U of L faculty who are participating and opening that clinic. Matt Ruther is an assistant professor in urban studies and the director of the Kentucky State Data Center. He's right in front of me, and he's here to talk about his study of what Louisville's population and economy will look like in 2040. I guess that's 24 years from now, if my math is correct, compared to what it looks like right now. So welcome, Matt. Glad you're here.
Thank you.
All right. So there's been a study. The Kentucky State Data Center did a study and kind of prognostications, I guess, for lack of a better term, and looked at from 2010 to 2040, what Louisville looks like in 2010, what Louisville should look like in 2040. What'd you find?
So I should just mention that we did this in concert with the Urban Studies Institute, also in my department. We found that the city is going to become increasingly diverse. So there's going to be growth in our minority populations, foreign-born populations, which are have been historically fairly small in this city. We see pretty steady growth across the different neighborhoods, more growth in sort of the outskirts, outside the Schneider and between the Watterson and the Schneider. And we expect to see increasing educational attainment because we've seen that in the past 2 decades.
So more people with degrees.
Exactly.
College degrees, right?
Exactly.
So those are the overall findings that you had. And I neglected to mention that the Kentucky State Data Center is a part of the University of Louisville. That's why you're on the show, right?
Correct.
So why don't you tell us what the data center is?
So the data center is an affiliate of the U.S. Census Bureau. We assist them in doing population estimates. Obviously, we do projections. The Census Bureau no longer does projections for states or counties. And we answer questions. We help people get data. Sarah Arisman is the research coordinator, and she answers the phone and helps you find what you need. And then we just promote census programming and census surveys and things of that nature.
All right. Well, let's get back into this study and talk a little bit of specifics here. In Jefferson County, Kentucky, I read your report, and there are 191 census tracts in Jefferson County. You say there's going to be more immigrants, folks moving from other countries to the Louisville area in the next 24 years or so. Are they going to move into, in those census tracts, are they going to be moving into specific places in Louisville, or like we have now, like around the Americana Apartments, around the airport, out in the Far East End? What's going to happen?
So oftentimes immigrants will move into places where there's existing populations, because there's social networks and so it makes sense that
move near
direction.
People that they know or that they're familiar with.
Exactly, and there's labor market or informal labor markets and things of that nature. So the Iroquois Park area, Beachmont, we would expect to see growth there. Butchill is sort of an increasing concentration of foreign-born. Some of the more inner neighborhoods might see a little bit of growth.
When you say inner neighborhoods, what do you mean by that?
I'm talking
Highlands
inside the Watterson.
Okay, inside the Watterson. Okay.
Yeah. So U of L itself has a lot of room for growth of the international population. So we may see some in this neighborhood also.
Around South Louisville, the old Louisville area, those kinds of areas.
Exactly.
Okay. And right now, when you look at Jefferson County, generally speaking, it's fairly segregated. You have, white folks live here, black folks live here. You have immigrant populations living in pockets of areas. Do you suspect that will stay that way by 2040? Can you prognosticate that far out, or is that a changing dynamic?
So across the United States, in every city, not just Louisville, there's a tremendous amounts of segregation. It has declined a little bit in the last 2 decades, but not dramatically. Do I think it will change? I think it will get a little bit better. I don't know that it's necessarily a racial dichotomy as much as it is an income We don't create housing we don't have mixed income housing essentially.
Right.
So it's possible. I've seen studies that say that Louisville is the most segregated city in the country, which I don't find that in my data, but it is certainly obviously a problem here. There's a very visible east-west divide.
Right. What are going to be the areas in Louisville that we're going to see growth, and where will we see population loss in the next 2 decades?
So when doing projections, you'll always, whatever you've seen in the past 10 years, say, is what you're going to see continue into the future, just by the nature of how projections are done. So we expect to see population loss in West Louisville, the Shawnee, Portland, Russell neighborhoods. And we've also projected some small loss in the Highlands, Germantown, Poplar Level area. This is mostly because we see declining household size in this neighborhood. So a household of 3 or 4 people will move out to a more suburban area, and then it will be replaced by a household of 1 or 2 people. And so it's not necessarily a loss in households, it's a loss in just the
total population, the number of people actually living there.
Exactly.
Right.
Those are the only 2 places we are projecting decline in the next 25 years.
But outside the Waterson is basically what you're talking about for growth.
Huge growth we expect outside the Snyder. So the Floyd's Fork areas, obviously the eastern part of the county.
How about where the new park is?
Exactly.
Parklands.
Exactly.
The study is called Louisville Metro Demographic and Economic Projections 2010 through 2040, and we're talking with Matt Ruther, who's an assistant professor in urban studies and also the director of the Kentucky State Data Center here at the University of Louisville. We're talking about that study. When it comes to employment and job growth in Louisville, what do you expect to see? What's going to be going up? What's going to be going down in terms of the sectors of the economy in Louisville?
So Jefferson County has a large competitive advantage in a couple of industries. Healthcare is one. We expect that to continue growing. And the second is transportation and utilities. So UPS. Exactly. We expect that to continue also. And in addition to that, we have a growing professional sector, which covers everything that you might expect a professional
White collar?
sector. Exactly.
White collar jobs?
Exactly.
And you think those will expand?
Yes.
Through 2040? What about manufacturing jobs, Ford, GE, those plants?
So manufacturing's been declining for many years. It's still a large employer in Jefferson County. We are projecting that it declines a little bit more, and then sort of reaches a level. Sort of a floor.
A plateau? Or
yeah.
Or a bottom. The way you said that, I don't know that's very optimistic. You said a floor. Does that mean we're going to drop a bunch of jobs and then stop?
I wouldn't say a bunch of jobs.
Okay.
A modest amount of jobs. And then there will be some minimum. We won't go below a minimum threshold. So there'll always be Ford, and there'll always be
GE or higher, or whatever it's called now, higher company.
And so we'll see jobs there, but maybe some losses.
Is that based on that we're going to have more robotics taking human jobs away, or is it because you just think that manufacturing jobs will move elsewhere?
I think there's definitely been some increases in productivity that make capital easier to work with than labor. And I think this has been going on. This has been definitely going on for some time now. And I also think that manufacturers are reaching that point where every company is looking to cut costs, and so there may be a whole layer of management that may be unnecessary. So we're not exactly sure what jobs in the manufacturing industry are going to go, because there's a whole number of different occupations within that industry. So it could be that the actual builders, the manufacturers, the factory workers stay steady, but the loss comes from the
white collar, the managers,
the officer parts of the jobs.
Right. All right. I'm talking with Matt Ruther from the Kentucky State Data Center. He's also an assistant professor in urban studies at the University of Louisville. And we're talking about economic and demographic, easy for me to say, projections in the Louisville area over the next 24 years or so. Matt, what did you find in terms of education? You said earlier that you expected the education levels to increase in Jefferson County and us to have more degree holders. What areas do you think that, is the speed engineering school going to start turning out, bunches of more students? We're going to have a lot more engineers, more white collars. You mentioned the medical sector. Where are we going to see these degrees come from?
So when I say that I expect the county educational attainment to increase, it's not necessarily people that are educated in the county. This is the whole county population. So, there's a couple of universities in Jefferson County, obviously UofL, which has been increasing in size, the number of students, the number of degrees conferred. So I wouldn't expect that sort of distribution to change dramatically. What we're seeing is that people that are moving into the city from other states or other counties in Kentucky primarily, but also other states, are fairly highly educated. So we're pulling in a more educated population that way.
That's good.
Exactly, and you see this in a lot of urban areas. And I know that Mayor Fisher and his team, this is something that is very attractive to them.
They're actively out recruiting folks to come to our city that have high levels of education.
Yes, this is one of the sort of the tenets of urban revitalization, and we see it sort of across the board. There was just a study put out. I don't know if it wasn't really a study. There was just a report put out today that the number of degrees conferred, the number of bachelor's degrees conferred in the state of Kentucky increased almost 4% between last year and this year. So there is some. It's not just people from other places, but the state itself is becoming increasingly
turning out more
educated.
college graduates.
Exactly.
Well, that's good. I did notice, though, the last report I think I saw from the 55,000 degree initiative in Louisville was that we were behind our markers in getting to the 55,000 additional college degrees by 2020. If that holds true, then we aren't going to be producing enough college graduates to meet the marketplace, are we, in Louisville? Or is that a possibility?
I don't know exactly.
I know you're not the education guru here. I probably put you on the spot on that one, didn't I?
No, I have tremendous respect for the 55,000 degrees people. I know many of them. Mm-hmm. I don't know exactly where the 55,000 came from.
Right.
It seems like a very optimistic goal. So I think, in my personal opinion, missing it by a little bit would not be tremendously horrible.
Okay.
I think they've done a wonderful job of increasing our levels.
I also noticed, too, getting back to the population numbers that you came up with in your study, you expect Jefferson County projected to grow by about 131,000 people by 2040. Where are we going to put them?
This county has lots of space. There's space everywhere. It's not very dense. You can see that in our urban form. There's lots of places that we could build new housing. There's lots of vacant lots. There's plenty of room. This number actually doesn't increase the density tremendously. So we're not talking there's going to have to be huge apartment buildings built all across the city. It's going to look pretty much like it is, but there's that much land. It's a very large place.
And you look specifically at Louisville. So growing by 131,000 people by 2040, is that, from your perspective, is that good, or is that normal? Is that average for what you see other Midwest cities growing, or what do you say?
I think it's average. And we're looking at the county here, and that's one of the sort of Louisville's one factor that makes it a little different than, say, comparing it to Cincinnati or Columbus or something. It's steady growth. It's not declining, which you see in some counties, Cuyahoga County, Cleveland, declining. So it's steady. It's not Phoenix. It's not Atlanta, but it's good. I think it's good.
All right. Anything else that you're working on with the Urban Studies Institute or with the Kentucky State Data Center, or that you've just completed that you're working on that might be interesting?
Yeah, we just did new population projections for the state. So what we've been talking about is just Jefferson County. We also have these for the entire state. We see a lot of variation in population forecasts for other counties, particularly in eastern Kentucky. We expect to see population loss in the coming decades. But this golden triangle of sort of I-65 corridor, I-75 corridor, I-64 corridor, we're expecting to see growth in these counties.
So the Northern Kentucky, Lexington, Louisville, that area grows. How about what I think Paul Coombs used to call the micro cities or something like Bowling Green, Owensboro, Pikeville, those areas?
The micropolitan areas.
Yeah, micropolitan.
We're seeing growth in those also. Essentially, it's a rural to urban migration where urban is pretty much any city.
So Kentucky is becoming more of an urban state.
Absolutely.
And that will continue?
I believe so. As far as states go, it's fairly rural still, quite rural. So there's a lot of room for some rural to urban migration. No normative statement, just that's what we expect to see.
The folks got to go where the jobs are, and the jobs are in Bowling Green and Owensboro and Paducah and Pikeville and Ashland.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay. All right. Well, Matt Ruther, always interesting to talk to you and have you on, and I may have to have you back on to talk about the state study.
Thanks so much.
All right. Thanks, Matt. Sherry Levinson is an assistant professor at UofL and the director of the Eating Anxiety Treatment Lab, and she's working with Lee Brosoff, who's a graduate student and working on the eating disorder research. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you very much.
Lee, did I pronounce your name correctly?
You did. I'm
Brosoff?
very impressed.
Oh,
Yeah.
very good. It wasn't
Thank you.
Brosoff, huh?
Yeah, Brosoff.
Brosoff. All right. Well, Sherry, why don't you tell us what the Eating Anxiety Treatment Lab and the Eating Disorder Clinic is? What is that?
Sure. So we've recently opened an eating disorder lab and clinic at U of L, and it's part of the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences. And we have 3 primary things that we're really interested in the lab. So the first one is looking at how eating disorders and anxiety disorders overlap with each other. So most individuals who have an eating disorder also have an anxiety disorder. It's been estimated that up to 80% of individuals with an eating disorder also have an anxiety disorder, so very high rates. But we don't yet know why they're so overlapping, and so that's one thing that we study in our lab.
Okay.
Then the second thing that we're really interested in is developing novel treatments for eating disorders. So anorexia nervosa is the psychiatric illness with the highest rate of mortality. And we don't really have any good treatments that work for anorexia nervosa, unfortunately.
That's hard to believe.
Yeah.
Really, it's been around for so long and people have been aware of it. Okay, but anyways.
It's a very difficult disorder to treat, and there just haven't been good treatments that have really been developed. So what we're working on are several new treatments in our lab where we are hoping that they're going to be very helpful for people with anorexia nervosa. And we're doing a couple studies right now specifically looking at exposure therapy and using that to treat anorexia nervosa and other eating disorders as well. And then the third thing that we do in our lab is use technology to treat eating disorders. So specifically, we're really interested in using mobile applications and using those as a treatment intervention. So those are the research things that are going on, and as part of that, there are clinical opportunities. So people who have eating disorders can come to the lab and clinic and get free treatment as part of a research trial. There's also possibilities that they can get other types of more standardized treatments for eating disorders if they need those as well. And then, of course, we're doing a lot of training of graduate students and undergraduates as well. So that's primarily what we've got going on now.
All right. Well, I've got a lot of questions about that,
Sure.
but let's get Lee in here. Lee, what is your role in all this? Now, you're working on a master's, correct?
I'm working on my PhD.
PhD,
So I'm
okay,
a
very good.
first-year grad student in the lab. So I am getting training in all of those things and doing research in the lab and according to all of those kind of different things.
So you're working with all 3 things that
Yes.
she just talked about, right?
Yes.
Okay. All right, we're talking with Sherry Levinson, who's an assistant professor at U of L and the director of the Eating Anxiety Treatment Lab and the Eating Disorder Clinic, and Lee Brosoff, who's a graduate student, as she just said, and working on some of these eating disorder research projects that they've got going on. All right, well, let me start with the top. What is an eating disorder? Just explain to me what an eating disorder is.
So an eating disorder is a mental disorder or psychological problem that has to do with eating. So anybody who has disordered eating, so that might be that the person does not eat enough food. It may be be that they eat a lot of food and then they use compensatory behaviors like vomiting or excessive exercise to get rid of the food. It might also just be something that's called binge eating disorder, which is where there's a lot of overeating, but there isn't these compensatory behaviors. So any sort of eating problem that causes distress and impairment would fall under the category of an eating disorder.
And Lee, you've done some work on this. Give me the range. What are we talking about? What's the worst kind of eating disorder I could possibly have that might kill me? And what's something that maybe a lot of people have? Obesity, for instance. I eat too much.
Right. I think all of the eating disorders that are diagnosable are pretty severe. And unfortunately, you're talking about a population who gets diagnosed with these things that it really affects them in all aspects of their life. But we also know that disordered eating, which is just, you might have preoccupation with thinking about eating a lot, body image issues, body dissatisfaction is really prevalent. So almost half of women in society and many men just struggle with regular body dissatisfaction, body image issues. So you kind of see the whole spectrum, but unfortunately, a lot of these issues are really, really prevalent in our society.
Well, you mentioned anorexia earlier, and bulimia. Where does that fall on the spectrum of?
So anorexia affects about 1% of the population,
Okay.
and bulimia affects between 4 and 6% of the
Okay.
population. But there's also subclinical levels of all of these disorders, as Lee's mentioned. So you might have somebody that doesn't quite meet for a diagnosis of bulimia nervosa, but they're struggling just as much as somebody that has a full diagnosis.
And you mentioned that these eating disorders are mainly psychological, correct?
Well, they're actually...
Or is that too simple for me? Sorry. You explain.
There's actually a huge biological component to eating
Okay.
disorders. So we know that about 50% of the variants of eating disorders, so if we're going to break it up into 100 parts, we know that 50% of those parts are genetic. So
Really?
there's this huge genetic component to eating disorders. But then you have a huge environmental, societal component on top of that. So it's really a combination of both.
Well, since we're talking about the societal impact, I know, Lee, that's what you worked on. You did a study and some research on that. So why don't you talk a little bit about what you found in your research? What was your research about, and then what did you find?
Sure. So we wanted to kind of look at some more risk factors for binge eating. And so what we looked at social appearance anxiety, which is kind of a fear of being judged on your appearance by other people. And it's a type of anxiety. And we looked at dietary restraint, so restricting the amount of food that you're eating and trying not to eat as many calories, and whether those were risk factors for binge eating, and whether they had also anything to do with a type of perfectionism called concern over mistakes, which is you're worried that you're going to make a mistake. And so what we found is that social appearance anxiety, or that fear that others are going to judge you negatively on your appearance, was the link between perfectionism and binge eating. So actually that was kind of what was causing the binge eating from perfectionism to binge eating, and that actually restrained eating wasn't as much of a factor kind of in that.
So I'm going to throw it out there. So the perfect student, the perfect daughter, the 17 years old, gets straight A's, is the captain of the field hockey team, and is a perfectionist and wants to look great. She's the homecoming queen. That person, chances are, I think is what you're saying, has a possibility of going into binge eating because she's a perfectionist. Is that correct?
That would be correct. Yeah. So someone, like you said, who has all of those attributes of being a perfectionist and really high achieving, and they, develop anxieties about how other people are viewing their appearance, and they internalize that, and so they're at risk for developing binge eating. Yeah.
When can you spot that? Do you spot that in young children, or does it get spotted when they're teenagers?
So perfectionism can start pretty early. We actually know that there's a genetic component to perfectionism too. So a lot of people are born with these really perfectionistic tendencies. And a lot of it starts to come out in adolescence. And that's also when eating disorders often start to develop as well.
Yeah, that's when we hear about it, these teenagers that are so worried about their appearance and mean girls at school making fun of their body shapes. that's when it really comes out, isn't it?
Yeah, well, there's actually two really developmental points. So one is adolescence and one is early adulthood around 21. So a lot of times when people go to college. But more and more we're seeing eating disorders in all ages, all ethnicities, all races, all sexual preferences. So what was once thought to be a disorder that only affected European American adolescents, we now know affects everybody.
Okay, we've got a couple minutes left to talk, so I want to give you a shot to talk about the new treatment trial that you've got coming at the University of Louisville. So why don't you talk a little bit about that and how our listeners might get involved in that?
Sure. So we've just started recruiting for a treatment trial. So what we are testing is what's called imaginal exposure therapy. So if you think about exposure therapy, so if you imagine somebody that has a spider phobia, for example, the way that we would treat that spider phobia would be to start off by exposing the person to a spider, maybe a picture of a spider, and then maybe we'd have a spider across the room. And then eventually we would work our way up to actually having that spider crawl all over the person. And that's what we call exposure therapy. It's exposing somebody to something that they're afraid of. Well, the hard thing with eating disorders is that a lot of the things that people with eating disorders are afraid of, we can't actually expose the person to in real life. So, for example, if you have somebody who's really afraid of immediately gaining weight, you can't make that person immediately gain weight. However, what you can do is you can have the person imagine that they're gaining weight and imagine what happens when they then gain weight. And we can use that as a way to reduce anxiety around gaining weight. And this type of treatment, if you know anything about treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder, this is what is used for post-traumatic stress disorder all the time. So VAs, everywhere that treats PTSD, they use prolonged imaginal exposure therapy. But it hasn't yet been tested for eating disorders. And so that's what we are starting to do at the University of Louisville. So anybody that has eating-related fears, whether that's whether you have a diagnosed eating disorder or you just have fears about eating or about body shape or appearance, we're hopeful that this type of therapy can be really helpful.
Okay, and so how does somebody get signed up? How
Sure.
do if I think I've got that and I want to participate, how do I sign up?
So they can go to our website. It's LouisvilleEatLab.com, and there is contact information on that page specifically about the study. So there's a web page about the imaginal exposure study, and they can use that to contact us as well as to learn more about the study.
And if you go to louisville.edu, the main Louisville webpage, and you look up Sherry Levinson, that last name Levinson, that'll get you there as well, right?
It sure will.
Get her email. All right. Sherry Levinson, Lee Brosoff, good luck with the Eating Disorder Clinic. Good luck with your research
Thank
and
you.
Getting a PhD.
Thank you very much.
All right.
I appreciate it.
All right, and we always try and wrap up these shows with a little trivia about the University of Louisville, so here's your little trivia for today. Did you know that UofL has one of the top baton twirlers in the world? Freshman Stephanie Lean from Lincoln, Nebraska is the most decorated twirler in her age group and has won 6 world championships. She received a full scholarship from UofL, which is one of the few schools in the country that actually offer full rides to its twirlers who are part of the UofL marching band. So there's your little piece of trivia about UofL for today. All right, UofL Today with Mark Hebert can be heard every Monday and Tuesday night after Ramsey and Rutherford right here on 93.9 The Ville. Catch the video versions on Louisville's Government Access channel, which is Metro TV, and statewide you can find us on KETKY, which is the Kentucky channel. You can also see a news story about something or someone cool at the University of Louisville every Monday morning on WHAS 11's Great Day Live. Thanks for listening to UofL Today with Mark Hebert on 93.9 The Ville, and go Cards!